Good evening, everyone. My name is Robin Silikatis, and it's a great pleasure to chair this evening's panel, the final event of 2 days of very intense and illuminating, if given the topic, not surprisingly at times also a bit depressing, discussions on the politics of nature. I'm very excited about this panel because we have such an amazing lineup tonight. And I honestly cannot think of a better set of interlocutors to discuss this question of the day: what is to be done? Now, it's clear to all of us in the room, I think, that we cannot continue living like this. It's probably less clear what exactly an alternative, sustainable form of life would look like. It's also less clear what the transition would look like. It's probably clear that it would involve new kinds of infrastructure, that it would involve new technologies, architectures, affects, but it would also involve, of course, a new kind of politics, and that's what we're going to discuss today. What kind of politics would be appropriate to the kind of transition that seems unavoidable? What is to be done? Let me very briefly introduce the panel. If you haven't spent the years of the pandemic in complete disconnection, you will know all three of our interlocutors, I think. But just a brief few words on them. Andreas Malm teaches human ecology at Lund University in Sweden. In his widely discussed books, he addresses the underlying structural dynamics behind climate catastrophe, as well as the question, what is to be done? Most recently in his book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, Learning to Fight in a World on Fire, which provides a very forceful argument for a more militant form of climate activism, which includes sabotage and property damage. Eva von Redecker is a German philosopher and author whose work also addresses both the fundamental crisis of our form of living, as well as the possibility of its revolutionary transformation. Her widely discussed book, Revolution für das Leben, Philosophie der neuen Protestformen from 2020, provides exactly that, a philosophical account of, and maybe even more importantly, a philosophical account for the new forms of protest, which very prominently include climate activism. And on my left, Rupert Reed, who teaches philosophy at the University of East Anglia in the UK, and is also a climate and environmental campaigner who has been a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion and a member of the Green Party. He has also, like the others, published extensively on the questions that we have been discussing over the last 2 days. And in one of his most recent books, Why Climate Breakdown Matters, tried to make the case to a broader public about the need for this transition, and also discusses different forms of activism and of getting there. And I think we have a kind of perfect setting because there's enough sufficient convergence on the kinds of topics we're talking about, but also sufficient divergence, I think, to have an interesting and hopefully constructive dialogue. So here's how we'll proceed. We'll first have brief introductory statements of around 5 minutes by our three panelists. Then we'll have a couple of rounds of discussion on the panel, on the aims, the different practices, but also the question of the subjects of that political transition. And finally, we'll of course open it up to questions and comments from the audience, and we'll try to end around 8 p.m. more or less on time. Okay, with that, we'll proceed in alphabetical order of the first names. I'll hand it over to Andreas for the first statement.
Hello? No, okay. Yeah, first of all, I want to thank Robin and Thomas, and I have to hold it like that. Okay. Yeah, I want to thank Thomas and the organizers of this beautiful conference, which has been very stimulating and I think remarkably thematically coherent. And I'm very honored to be on this panel. What I'll do is just offer a few general observations on what I see in this very specific conjuncture. And I restrict my comments to Europe and say a few words about the climate movement here. And when I refer to the climate movement, I mean organizations or groups that explicitly fight for climate justice and against the climate crisis in one way or another. And I think what we've seen over the past 4 years is, of course, the enormous wave in 2018 and 19 that was unprecedented in our countries, in Europe, in terms of the number of people that are brought onto the streets for this cause. And there's been very significant changes since then. I think one of the big changes is that in 2018 and 19, the two newcomers to the scene, the Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion, had a very clear tactical vision of how they were going to achieve their aims. And were very confident about the potential of their tactics. So in the case of Fridays for Future, it was the strikes. And in the case of XR, it was a particular idea of civil resistance, by which XR meant strictly non-violent forms of protest, originally conceived as a sort of copy of the moment of 2011, with the takeover of squares in central towns and shutting down capitals. And the idea was that if we do this, we're going to topple business as usual, something like that. Now, both of these visions have lost quite a lot of their self-confidence, if you like, since then. Because, of course, what happened was that this wave of mobilization crashed suddenly and abruptly in early 2020 with the outbreak of the pandemic, which essentially just killed the whole cycle of mobilization, because the decision from the leadership of both of these movements was to suspend activities, because there was the belief that you couldn't have social protest under the conditions of the pandemic. Now, that proved wrong, as we know from the uprising after the murder of George Floyd and several other instances, but this was the immediate reaction from the movements. Since then, after the pandemic, or its worst phase, the movement has tried to regain momentum. It hasn't really. I mean, we're still very far from the momentum that we had in late 2019. And the movement has been groping for the next steps, the next phases. And in the case of Fridays for Future, this involves a lot of discussions about what to do apart from the strikes and the demonstrations on certain Fridays that have, to an extent, developed a kind of a ritual character. And I don't think that the Fridays for Future have concluded that this tactic has exhausted its potential, but my sense from communicating with the young cadres of this movement is frustration with, obviously, the state of affairs of the planet, and with the totally unshakable, apparently, persistence of business as usual, even during and after the pandemic, with a rebound in emissions. And, of course, now the extreme boom in fossil fuel profits and production that we're seeing this year. But also a kind of frustration with the tactical formula of the Fridays for Future as it was developed in 2018-19, and a wish to do something more. With XR, we're seeing a similar process, and it's quite remarkable how the traditional, original XR idea of how societies are changed, the so-called theory of change, is now, I would say, in shambles. Because now, even Erika Chenoweth, the main preacher of the strategic pacifism, this idea that non-violent resistance is always more successful than armed or violent or militant resistance, is admitting the opposite. In her most recent paper, which was extensively covered in New York Times today, she concedes that whatever statistical edge nonviolent protest might have had over armed insurrection is now gone. So even she, who of course has been, quite ferociously criticized for her methodology and her treatment of the evidence by others who would say that the evidence in fact shows that it's militant resistance that is more successful, even she is recognizing that this is now holding true. So the whole, the sort of social science package that XR founded itself upon in 2018-19 is no longer there in that coherent sense. And what you see in XR circles is a search for escalation. And this comes off very clearly in the various offshoots that XR has produced, predominantly in the UK, with first Insulate Britain and now Just Stop Oil. And Just Stop Oil really is all about tactical escalation, that we have to step up and move beyond what we did back in 2018-19. And this, of course, has made some quite spectacular headlines over the past weeks, and I think we're inevitably going to have to discuss our views of what Just Stop Oil has been doing recently. Now, we're seeing here a kind of a fragmentation of the scene in the climate movement in Europe. We're also seeing a stage of experimentation with a much more open sense that we don't know exactly what's going to work. We don't have our clear tactical formulas as we had back in 2018-19. And we're searching for what will suit us best as tactical instruments when we move ahead over the next couple of years or so. Then I also think that escalation, tactical escalation, is virtually inevitable, and the recent attempts or turns towards sabotage and property destruction that we've seen, just the first signs of, will continue. And I, for one, am very strongly in favor of this. I think that if we look around at the landscape of social struggle in the world, what we see as the rule really is precisely a diversity of tactics. Just look at the glorious uprising in Iran that is happening right now after the murder of Mahsa Amini, followed by several other murders of young children. It's a school book example of a popular uprising with a diversity of tactics, where, of course, the vast bulk, quantitatively speaking, of the activities in that uprising are peaceful, as in women taking off their hijabs, burning them, cutting their hair, giving the finger to pictures of Ayatollah Khamenei, but where there is a very significant component of militant confrontation with the Basij and the Pastaran, and property destruction, as in activists scaling the big pictures of the Ayatollahs and the mullahs that adorn the streets of Tehran and destroying them, tearing them down. And that is how mass protest looks. It almost always has been that case, and it certainly is the case in our era, that it has a broad spectrum of actions within it. And the climate movement needs to develop something similar. And therefore I think the move away from pretty dogmatic conceptions of tactics that we saw in 2018 and 19 is a good one. I still think that the climate movement has a long way to go to sort of articulate or even embody a kind of social force that it hasn't done yet. I mean, sometimes there is still that sense that there is something, how should I put this to make sense of it, artificial or forced about climate activism, as it doesn't have a social depth yet of the kind that it needs. And here it's going to be interesting to see over the next few months if things might change, because in Europe right now we're in a stage where two very significant countries, France and the UK, are moving towards a winter of what looks like serious social discontent. It seems like it's only countries like Germany and Sweden that are completely immune to this. But I mean, in Germany, this is a paradox that I very often think about. Germany has what I see as by far the most powerful climate movement in Europe, with the one that I like most, Ende Gelände, which, by the way, also is, I think, the only one that has maintained its tactical formula for what is now 7 years without having reason to fundamentally revise it, because it works so well. And it always outwits the cops. It always reaches its tactical goals, most recently in August. Germany has the continent's most powerful climate movement, but no significant class struggle that I can detect. And in Sweden, we have nothing. There's no class struggle, and there's no climate movement. There's only the far right. Only the far right in Sweden. Anyway, In the UK and France, we have trade unions on the march with major strikes happening and with the threat of these expanding massively. And it's going to be interesting to see if there's any chance for any of this to sort of hook up with climate activism. And here I would say that the situation looks quite different between the two countries because France, really there's a lot of unevenness here. France has probably still the most vibrant tradition of working class struggle in Western Europe, but it doesn't have a climate movement. So it's the opposite situation to Germany. In the UK, you have a very vocal and, you know, young and quite bold climate movement, and you have a fundamentally sclerotic trade union movement, but one that is starting to move a little bit. And it's going to be interesting to see if there are any synergies possible in that country. I don't see currently the synergies happening in France, and I think it's interesting to, when we talk about the potential of the trade union movement, to consider exactly how to relate to the strikes in the oil refineries in France, which are fundamentally about workers demanding a share of the windfall profits accruing to Exxon, Mobil, and Total. And from a climate standpoint, I mean, from a class standpoint, your reflexive position would be to support these workers, but from a climate standpoint, it doesn't feel like the best demand. Yeah, I'll leave it there. But we're in a moment of things being in flux in the climate struggle, I would say, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you. Eva, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a real luxury to have spent the last 2 days absorbing all this wealth of theorizing in this room, and also thank you for Andreas to starting laying out an overview of the broader landscape of protest, as it were, and I will zoom in a bit on the specific forms that I would wish for and also enjoy already seeing in the climate movement. I think for the question of a politics of nature, it's more true, even more true than for all other dimensions of politics, that it has to be materialist, that it has to touch on the very question of how we reproduce ourselves as a species. And normally, one way how you make a politics, not just a politics, but a revolution or a materialist politics, is to focus on what the labor is that you want to liberate. So, and I think on the topic of nature, we haven't gone far enough maybe to focus on what that might be, right? The labor of nature that we want to liberate, or even the self-liberation of which we should assist as social movements. And maybe one way, so I'm just going to say a few sentences on that, and then I move to some very concrete protest forms. Maybe one intermediate step to get that question into view is to remind ourselves of something that all of you are aware, that is that the materialist feminist movement over the last, well, even decades, has been very successful in bringing to the forefront the notion of reproductive labor. Also, like especially in Argentina, where we have the biggest mass movement of feminism, the idea of a feminist strike around care work is sort of central to the strategy. Now, reproductive labor is the labor that reproduces life. And in some way, that's also what nature does, or what life does to itself. It reproduces itself. However, it doesn't do that in the standard form of labor, because it's not intentional. Like, there isn't a subject that decides to do exactly this. So life regenerates itself. Maybe one could say it's not reproductive labor, but regenerative time. And this regeneration, or this regenerative time in which nature kind of comes, replenishes, reconstitutes all its elements and its connections, is one that has a specific structure. It's a structure of repetition, of cyclical replenishment, but in lots of interlocking ways. So you have things that have a very short span of reproducing themselves, like life of an animal, and then you have very long things like a forest, and then you have a climate system over that, and they all interlock because nothing regenerates alone. It regenerates into in an integrated way. And it happens that for 12,000 years during the Holocene, there has been a very harmonious and stable way of this reproduction happening, or regeneration happening, that allowed human flourishing within it. And one way to describe what the climate catastrophe is not this kind of apocalypse that we're waiting for, but it is the dysbiosis is the technical term. It's the kind of desyncing or the falling apart of the ecological sort of, well, productive way of all those tides of regeneration interlocking. So ecosystem breakdown is that some factor changes that makes the sort of synchronization of all the others fall apart. And we don't only see that in big catastrophes, we also, like for me as a farm girl I am, the fact that we have a second flowering of daisies end of October is as much a horror as the Amazon burning, because you see that there is this desyncing. So politics of nature would need to be a conscious effort of liberating the proper functioning of such regeneration and also the actual active assistance in that. And the labor regime we have does everything to avert our labor in a completely irrational, different way, where we work for profit, for the aggrandizement of capital, and not for this kind of regeneration of natural time. Whereas it would actually be the full realization of our capacity of a species to not just reproduce ourselves in a self-determined way, but also, following this beautiful line that Karen quoted from Marx, know how to produce according to the measure of every other species. Like humans can do that. That's what we do, for instance, when we farm. We decide that we assist sort of the tide of growth of a potato over and against the thistle. And then if you know a bit more, you know there need to be some thistle so that there can be butterflies, so that there can be pollination and so on. So there is a labor struggle of nature that is a struggle for regenerative time. So how does that translate to strategy? The first thing I want to say is I always get a bit uneasy when I'm asked to give ideas about strategy, because I'm at the moment not like formally organized in any movement. So usually when I am in that situation that actual movements ask me, I'm always like, well, probably you know better. And also like the first thing I want to say is like, take care of yourselves and like look after each other. And you know, this is going to be a long, hard thing. Don't burn out, because you need actual like, you know, stable, flourishing activists to have any mass movement. But then also I think I want to just bring two examples of actions that are already happening in Germany that I think are very good examples of this kind of struggle for the liberation of regenerative natural time, and that work on different scales and interlock. The first is soil or field occupation. And I'm thinking of one particular one, an Ackerbesetzung, so a land occupation, in Neu-Eichenberg. I don't know whether anyone has heard about it, but I think it's a spectacular example. It's 80 hectares of agricultural, very good agricultural land in the central Germany that was supposed to be the building ground for an Amazon logistics center. And there have been young organic farmers from a nearby university who have for 3 years occupied that land, made what they called the disobedient vegetable collective, where they grew a lot of food that they gave away for free, restored biodiversity to that area, and they actually managed to stop, so the investor disappeared, and they also won over the local politics and now have the mayor. So it's really interesting how that didn't also then just breed fascist counter-reaction from the population in the area. So that like occupation of sites where actual kind of regeneration could happen, I think is a very important strategy. And also from the first-person accounts of some of the participants, it is actually regenerating. They are really proud and happy, and they have really good food to eat there, and they live there in very cool ways that like so that's, I think, also sort of self-regeneration of the movement. And then the second thing is, just very briefly as a last sentence, for any such actions to be possible, we need to meet it from the other side, as it were, from the kind of centers, with an expansion of the socialization movement that is already underway and has the one famous, wonderful example of the attempted socialization of the German real estate company, Deutsche Wohnen, that on that model, we need to kind of fight for the socialization of everything, of course, in the end. But at first, starting with those sectors that directly reproduce like human life, like, for instance, the health sector, and of course now in the energy crisis, the energy sector. So part of, and also Engelland and other left groups, the EL, are pursuing this idea of socializing RWE, which is the main German coal mining and coal burning electricity company. And I think that that would be the absolutely necessary step and precondition for then thinking about, okay, how could we create energy so that it complies with the regeneration of resources and also human life, because it's a world with humans in that we want to see continue laboring, but in a liberated form.
Excellent, thank you, Eva, and Rupert, I give you.
So, our situation is desperate. Desperate is the word that is most appropriate here. We have an unprecedented crisis, and we have still a lack of sufficient awareness of how unprecedented the crisis is. In other words, part of the desperateness resides precisely in the desperateness of the situation not being recognized. This is what I call the meta-emergency. The climate, more than emergency, is redoubled as an emergency precisely in that it isn't really recognized by almost anybody as an emergency. So how to respond to a situation as desperate as this? We must respond to it in truth. We must respond to it in its full measure. And just because it's so desperate and extreme, and we're liable to get desperate about it, we have at the same time to try to preserve our own dignity and civility and what is slightly misleadingly called our humanity through it all. And why do I say this? Well, I say it because it's true, but I also say it because we're at the start of a debate here where there's going to be some disagreements. And I think it's really important that we try to maintain those qualities through that debate. My teacher, Joanna Macy, was asked by an interviewer a few years ago, Joanna, you're in your 90s now. You're a lot more pessimistic than you were in your 60s or 70s. Why do you even carry on now? You could just sort of retire. And she replied, I carry on because as this gets worse, I don't want you to turn on each other. I don't want my students, my children, the people I respect and love to turn on each other. So in 2019, the radical flank, Extinction Rebellion, the school strikes, etc., achieved something remarkable, and I think we should acknowledge that fully. A partial mainstreaming of climate concern. It had never happened before. There was then a plateau, and what many of us concluded is you can't just carry on doing the same thing over and over again. So what now? So the logical thing might seem to be to go further, to escalate. That is what the Roger Hallam movement-inspired movements of Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil have done. That is what Andreas is recommending us to go even further in doing. So should we do that? It seems to be the most natural thing to do. What about considering something really surprising, doing the opposite? As I see it, the window has been opened, a hole has been punched in the pre-existing consensus by the radical flank. What we need to do is we need to lead masses of people through it, while at the same time deepening our truth-telling to wake up more still. So I'm agreeing, by the way, you'll have noticed there that leadership is called for. But Leninism? If eco-Leninism means a vanguard that wins without waking up many, many more people more and bringing them on board into action, then it is impossible. It is a contradiction in terms. Because what is so unique about this crisis is the extraordinary extent to which it is one that saturates our whole lives. The climate more than emergency is quotidian every day. There is no non-democratic solution to it, and thus, incidentally, the deep importance of upgrading democracy. Or put it another way, if it were possible to tackle this crisis without consent, it would be so only at the cost of an entirely dystopian police state, which would make Stalin blush. Moreover, I see no appetite yet for eco-Leninism anyway, no constituency for it of more than a minuscule size. Whereas the new mass, truth-based, moderate flank that is emerging has, I think, huge potential. What I mean in talking about this new moderate flank is something that will mainstream action, not just activism. One of the main barriers to entry into the climate movement is the requirement that one be an activist. That very self-identity puts off most people to begin with. So what I'm thinking about is things like professions organizing themselves, lawyers, advertising execs, fiduciaries. I'm thinking about communities organizing themselves to adapt as well as to mitigate. And that's what I think could conceivably work. A mass moderate flank to complement, to take advantage of the partial success that the radical flank has had. Deliberately non-polarizing, deliberately inclusive in ways that don't always make us, by us I mean something like the people in this room, comfortable. Largely a bottom-up phenomenon, distributed. Because it's really important to be clear that there is a ceiling to what the radical flank can achieve. We saw some of that ceiling towards the end of 2019. And we're seeing it again now. The radical flank polarizes, that's what it does. It will probably never feel inclusive to most people. It cannot complete the mainstreaming job it began. And in a society where the possibility of achieving the kind of climate action we need by consent is being ruined by polarization, we have to look to a way forward which will be unpolarizing. So either you believe we can just bypass the mainstream, some version of eco-Leninism as Andreas and presumably Zizek favor, or you must consider the possibility of a way of completing the mainstreaming job that the radical flank began. And that is what I am proposing. A mass moderate flank made possible by the groundbreaking that the radical flank has achieved since 2019. I believe it's probably our best hope. And the last thing I'd like to say before we moved into the debate proper is that the best compliment that we can pay to the success, the partial success that the radical flank has had, is precisely to build such a new mass moderate flank.
Excellent. Thank you to all the three of you for these extremely focused and at the same time already discussion opening statements. Maybe we can really start with this point that Rupert just ended on, because it seems to me that there are maybe three models of thinking about political activism in the current constellation. And of course, the way I will present them will be overdrawn, but then I'd invite the three of you to make the whole picture more complex. So in a way, you could have the kind of, let's say, liberal model in which, yeah, you need some activism to push people to vote for the right kind of party, to push governments to be more responsive to the situation, but broadly speaking, within the existing system, without sort of questioning its ability to engender the kind of transition that is necessary. Second, there seems to be a model that Rupert just referred to as climate Leninism, in which some kind of party organization, maybe vanguardist, is needed in order to sort of seize the means of power of production and sort of turn the system around towards dismantling the kind of infrastructure that regular politics will never be able to get at because of the kind of constellation of power relations and interests that stand in its way. And third, there seems to be a kind of, let's say, radical democratic approach in which is also revolutionary, but follows a different model, building maybe on the interstitial dimensions in which sort of more democratically controlled bottom-up initiatives experiment with forms of scaling up. And I think these these three models, just for simplicity's sake, call them sort of more or less liberal, more or less Leninist, and more or less kind of radical democratic. They all have their challenges, obviously. You know, I mean, the challenges of the first one are the most obvious because that's the one we're having, and it's just doesn't work very well. Obviously, there are challenges to the so-called Leninist model, but there are also challenges to this question of how to scale up the local and interstitial and the kind of experiments that are already happening. So I would just like to invite the three of you to speak a bit about that constellation and maybe make the picture more complex beyond this very simplistic triptych that I just built. And maybe, Eva, you want to start this time?
Well, obviously, or not obviously, I do think that the interstitial model is one that helps some of the kind of impasses of the other models, and also that somewhat takes for granted that the other stuff is also happening. But I want to say one thing about the idea of being moderate and mainstream compatible. And so it's interesting because I'm really kind of torn there, because I do spend a lot of my life talking to people who are not here, and also experience that often they are much easier to sort of shift their position than some of the so-called like stakeholders in discourse who already. So I definitely I'm in favor of the whole like trust the people approach. But it is just the case that given what the climate crisis is and how like you like also showed us that picture of how dramatic it is, that on the more moderate, mainstream, compatible level, you cannot formulate solutions that are actual solutions. But even with the best intent of not polarizing, you will polarize like hell if in bloody Germany you say, oh, we should have a speed limit of 100 kilometers. Polarizes and doesn't solve the problem. Or in this situation, if you say, like, heat less. I mean, I find myself in that paradox all the time because I just happen to live in a house that doesn't heat, like doesn't have central heating. So I could say a lot of how to live at 15 degrees, but it's now the way that we've messed up the energy crisis, that's cynical and like idiotic, because people feel it's being kind of brought about them in an unjust way, that's energy saving. So if you're a proper like someone with the people, someone from the left, you have to say nobody should freeze in Berlin in winter. And then that you can't reconcile. Whereas if you said, well, just socialize the energy companies, also do some large-scale kind of heat pump drilling for whole cities that then gives you energy for free, then suddenly you've solved the social question and the ecological question at the same time, precisely by not being moderate and hopefully polarizing less. And of course I know that that proposal in itself will polarize, and so there's no way out, but if I have to polarize, then I'd do it in that way. And it's interesting how often with that you win over people more than with anticipating a kind of compromise that then seems fishy or something. And yeah, maybe I think I can want to say more about the Leninism question. I have a lot, but I don't want to anticipate that because we've elaborated now. It's just a kind of stir puppet in the room, so yeah.
Andreas?
I guess I feel a little bit interpolated by the stuff on ecological Leninism. So let me just point out that the idea that ecological Leninism would mean a vanguard destroying democracy and replacing the masses with itself, and trashing all idea of consent and just, you know, run roughshod over people, has nothing to do with actual historical Leninist politics. It's just a caricature of what Leninism was all about. And it has nothing to do with ecological Leninism as anyone that I know of has proposed it. I myself drew a very crude sketch of this idea in a book I wrote during the pandemic when I was here in Berlin. Others who've toyed with this idea include Derek Wall and Jody Dean and Kai Heronen. No one is suggesting that this is what ecological Leninism would be. When I use that term, I refer to three components. One, trying to turn crises of symptoms into transformational crises of for the drivers, the causes of catastrophe, along the lines of what Lenin did in relation to the First World War. An admission that the state will be necessary in the transition, unlike the anarchist idea. And third, very much a stress on how little time we have, in contradistinction to classical reformism, which argues that we have a lot of time for incremental change. These were the three components of my ecological Leninism. None has anything to do with destroying democracy. To the contrary, I believe that if you want to build a mass movement, or if you want the climate struggle to take on a mass scale, the first thing you have to do is ditch the idea that you can achieve this without polarization. There is never any mass movement in history without polarization. That is what mass politics is always about. Changing society fundamentally and challenging vested interest and confronting deeply entrenched power is absolutely impossible without antagonism. That means you have to build mass social force that can overwhelm the force that you're up against. And the normal scenario here is then a dialectical relation between moderate flanks and radical flanks, not an abolition of one or the other. So, I mean, the whole idea of a radical flank, of course, presupposes a continuous division of labor with a moderate flank. But what Rupert seems to suggest here is that the radical flank was something we had back in 2018 and 19. Now we can abolish it and just go for the moderate flank. I don't see that as a way forward. On the question of appetite, well, clearly the masses are not out on the streets clamoring for ecological Leninism. That would be a ridiculous argument. But there seems to be sort of an agreement here on the stage that in the climate movement there is appetite for tactical escalation. Rupert said that that seems to be the natural next step, and I think it would be very wrong for us to try to tell the climate movement to stop in its tracks and, you know, stay calm or whatever, rather than joining this movement towards escalation and discussing the pros and cons of various tactical things. Lastly, I just want to say that among the forms that have cropped up recently, forms of climate direct action, I think the tire extinguishers is an interesting example where you have a type of extremely gentle kind of sabotage that doesn't even damage or destroy anything. It's just a matter of disabling SUVs momentarily. But this is so easy to do that it has spread very rapidly, and the tire extinguishers now have what they call cells in about 13 countries, and they've disarmed something like almost 10,000 SUVs in half a year. And they consistently target the most affluent neighborhoods in the cities where they operate. And this is a kind of a mixture of climate struggle and class struggle, which I think is promising. And the class struggle here is not a class struggle in the workplace. And I really think that we absolutely have to broaden our idea of what class struggle is these days from beyond classical workplace organizing only. Because the struggle because the landscape of class is so different from what it used to be. I totally agree with Eva about the potentials for synergies in this moment in the energy crisis, and the potentials that demands for nationalization and massive rollout of renewables have to speak to people in this moment. It just seems difficult to pull off.
Thank you.
So let's start with a point of agreement there. I think we're all three on side with this idea about the incredible opportunity offered by the energy crisis. The way I would put this is that this is an amazing opportunity to move outside pre-existing ideological dividing lines. In the same kind of way as happened during the Second World War, for example, where food rationing was brought in countries like the UK, had an enormous egalitarian effect. But of course wasn't brought in as a left-wing ideological measure. It was brought in for the sake of survival and potentially a kind of flourishing. In the exact same kind of way, we should be making that kind of argument in relation to what the energy crisis demands, and that kind of argument in relation to what the climate crisis demands. Now that's what XR meant when we said that we were going beyond ideology and beyond party politics, but we didn't follow it through properly. And I'm calling for a movement that would really follow it through properly. Now, Andreas says there's never been a movement like that. There's never been a mass movement that was unpolarizing. Yeah, we're trying to do something new. In autumn 2018, when we were getting together to launch Extinction Rebellion, comms specialists and psychologists came to us and they said, please don't do this. For God's sake, don't do this. You cannot, for starters, call yourselves Extinction Rebellion. You must tell a positive story. If you have doom in the very kind of title, you're just going to depress everybody. It's going to be a disaster. Thank God we completely ignored them. We went ahead and we did something new that went against all the rule books, and it worked. So we're trying to do something new, and the reason we're trying to do it is that things being polarizing or not is partly a matter simply of how things are. I mean, you cannot magic away the polarizing nature of much radical flank activity. It is inherent, I think that's been admitted. It's usually, in fact, deliberate. And this crisis demands as much unity as is feasible because of its thoroughly mundane quotidian basis in many of our everyday practices. And that's partly why we need to move beyond protest to action to directly improve things. This is what I call the sense in which the mass moderate flank that we envisage, is more radical than the radical flank. To be clear, in response to Ava about what I mean by moderate, what we mean by moderate, we do not mean moderating in any way our assessment of what the situation demands, and that's what I meant by saying it's all about coming from truth. In fact, it's about coming from truth more fully than we have done before. Now, Andreas says, yes, but you can't get sufficient change through incremental change to head off what's coming, and that's true. What's coming is going to go on getting worse for a very long time. There is going to have to be a lot of adaptation. There is going to have to be a lot of loss and damage. The tragic reality of the situation is that there is no shortcut here. And this is one of the problems with the radical flank model, and you see it with Just Stop Oil, that half the time people in Just Stop Oil say things like, we've got 3 years to save the world, we're going to turn it all around within 3 years. People from Just Stop Oil say things like, we're going to bring down the government. No, you're not. That's a fantasy. And the radical flank is inherently vulnerable to that kind of fantasy politics. The mass moderate flank that we envisage, is going to try to get beyond that to a longer, slower grind that can actually work. And yes, there is going to be immense suffering in the process. That is now tragically a matter of fact. And finally, it's a matter of where we put our energy partly. I'm not saying, let's abolish the radical flank or something like that. I don't have any authority to do that anyway. What I'm saying to people like people in this room, people who may be watching, is what's actually the smartest thing to do right now? Is it to do sort of a bit more of what Just Stop Oil are doing, or a bit more of what the tire extinguishers are doing? I don't think that really leads us anywhere. In 2019, the radical flank achieved something. What we need to do now is take full advantage of that achievement, and that's what I'm trying to outline, what we might be able to do.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, one question that would follow, I think, from the discussion now, where there is, some sort of, I think, agreement about the need for diversity of tactics. There is disagreement about the emphasis and about which sector of that diversity of tactics is the most promising and should be most prominent in going forward. But I wonder if we zoom out a bit more, whether it's not necessary to think about the transition in even broader terms. I mean, one thing I found very fascinating about this novel that everyone seems to be discussing right now in terms of climate catastrophe, Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future, is that beyond the diversity of tactics of climate activism, you have, in his case, a kind of sort of famous optimism in terms of science and the need for science to actually be part of this transition, but also for sort of good old technocrats, for central banks, surprisingly prominent role in this book, and for people who build technological infrastructures, etc. I was just wondering, what your view is on that even broader diversity of transitional strategies, many of which will have to be revolutionary in one way or the other, but quite different from what we're talking about in terms of specific political tactics of activism.
Actually, if it's okay for me to start again, that I could connect that with something that I wanted anyway to say about a certain convergence in both your positions on sort of the state. Because I actually think both the XR tactic of sort of raising awareness of the catastrophe and doing civil disobedience always kind of acts in that fantasy that the government we have or the government that we will topple and then there will be another, will implement those demands. And the same, like also with, I mean, we would really need to talk about what Leninism, right? But in the 1917 state and revolution, then the idea is that the state as it is not a tool that functions, that it needs to be destroyed, and that we need a different kind of more democratic distributed state. And already then it didn't sort of work. We have a very centralized authoritarian aftermath. And I think that what we see at the moment is that neoliberal state agency has become so vacuous and so much like is running not even on a capitalist performance principle anymore, or not even on a kind of rationality of safeguarding profit making, but really on some kind of insane, like, I don't know, reality principle of pain and sacrifice and austerity, that they seem to be the last ones responsive to the address, so sort of rational address by a movement. And I mean, in the UK, for instance, now, it actually, the people who know the scene there say that the energy companies are going to collapse because the big investors are withdrawing, while the Tory government is trying to do everything to kind of help keep fossil fuel alive. So I think it's just a very, very long shot to address those institutions. And I don't even want to make a kind of general anarchist argument here, but just that in the current situation, it seems to me to be very delusional to have that structure of appeal. And I think part of why I think we need a structure of kind of prefiguration and then really defending those, a bit like the zona défendre in France, like defending those 80 hectares is because we cannot trust the institutions that are there to do the job. I mean, we would, of course, need to build the power to have others, but we are very far away from that. And one last thing about the transition, I think it is important to understand that in the environmental and species extinction crisis, something that looks local is already sort of connected through a worldwide ecosystem. So if on 80 hectares you keep up a certain diversity, it does change something for the insect population of a larger area, and then for the bird population, like migrating across the globe, like it's never purely local, even if you have a local strategy, and then you can build your mass movement around sort of defending something or conquering something. So I think it makes sense to directly want to conquer the energy infrastructure or the train, like motorway and train infrastructure, rather than to appeal to politics for implement at this historical moment.
Well, I mean, before handing it to Rupert and then to Andreas, I mean, I guess the challenge is then still how, you know, I understand the point. I think it's a very important one, but how do you then think about the scaling up the infrastructures? I mean, even if you admit that the local is always connected, the question is, you know, can it be connected on the basis of these prefigurations in a way that actually produces an alternative that is more than something that the existing system can very well tolerate? Because in the end, it doesn't really matter whether they occupied 80 hectares and defend them successfully and there are some local connections, as long as the overall structures remain in place. So, you know, maybe at some point we also should talk about the, you know, are these the right alternatives? Ignoring the state and doing your own thing versus just appealing to the state. What would be, you know, other alternatives of thinking about this constellation? But before we come back to you, I'll hand it over to Rupert and then to Andreas.
Yeah, so I'm super sympathetic with what you're just saying. I was very struck, for example, in your description of the struggle around this 80 hectares land by the fact that the folks on the land had managed to win over the locals. That is exactly what we're envisaging in the sort of geographic community strand of the new moderate flank strategy. What we want to do is to get people in communities all over the country, all over any country for that matter, but we're sort of starting in the UK mostly, to be trying to kind of create structures and kind of centers of attraction in their community, such that when some kind of fight like that comes along, or when some kind of obstacle is encountered, then you're in a good position to get people on side and to appeal to a far wider constituency than you can appeal to on any ideological basis. So, for example, to be able to appeal successfully to small c conservative people. And that's what I think we have to be able to do if we're actually to get through this in the best way that we can get through it, which, as I say, is going to involve enormous suffering and disaster for certain, even in the best case scenario. But the best case scenario is that we harness awareness of that and we build as wide alliances as possible to get through that. And that's going to have to involve going way outside of our comfort zone. That's the kind of paradoxical suggestion at the heart of this, rather than taking some kind of standard logic of escalation to try to start moving in the opposite direction. And one more thought on that in relation to the school climate strikers. What I see among the school climate strikers is a desperation and an anger which is totally understandable, which I worry will lead them into a kind of ever-decreasing circle of actions that put off more and more people from joining them. And what I'm trying to figure out and suggest is how we get into the opposite kind of situation, into a virtuous circle, where we start sense-making in such a way that people start to see that there's something big here that they can relate to, that they can get on board with, that they can identify with, across swathes of the population that would never normally be remotely willing to think of themselves as activists.
Just a word on escalation before I say something about Kim Stanley Robinson, which I think is an excellent reference point in all these discussions. We need to remember that climate breakdown is very different from almost all other kinds of problems that social movements confront, in that it's hardwired to deteriorate. It will only get worse. This is different from something like inequalities in general, or, I don't know, police brutality against African Americans in the US, or for that matter, the hijab in Iran, where you can have a stagnant average of oppression or repression that hovers around something similar year after year after year, decade after decade after decade. I mean, the hijab situation in Iran has been the way it is now for more than 30 years without getting considerably worse or considerably better. It's just been the dreary and monotonous same forever, it feels like, if you're living in Iran. The climate crisis is nothing like that. It only gets worse, worse, worse. And then it would be very strange if the climate movement didn't escalate. If the climate movement continued to do what it did in early phases of this crisis, that I think would be a recipe for irrelevance. Because this crisis deepens, the climate movement needs to step up. And it won't appear a credible force if it even takes steps back from more militant forms of struggle to more moderate ones. Now, as for Kim Stanley Robinson, which again is a great source to think with here, his book really, I mean, it's aesthetically an experiment in a diversity of tactics, because he writes in so many different ways in the chapters in the book. And then sort of, you know, it's a cacophony of form that corresponds to the cacophony of tactics that he describes in the book. He engages, I think, in some really useful thought experiments about what a best case scenario would look like in this century. That's how he describes the book, where there is this, you know, endless combination of different things happening with all sorts of social movements and actors coming into play. And of course, a great diversity of technology. So the book is a lot about technologies as well as social struggle. And here I am in disagreement with some of what he's doing. Most fundamentally, I think he gets the idea of solar geoengineering wrong. And that plays a very big part in his book. And I think that he has a naive optimism about how solar geoengineering would work. And he shares that optimism with others on the left, notably Holly Jean Buck, close friend of mine. And this is something I'm working on myself right now. I'm not going to go into it, but I do think that his general approach, that some technologies will have to be embraced by progressive forces as well, notably those that have to do with negative emissions or carbon drawdown, is a fruitful and promising one. But I would draw the line against solar geoengineering, where I don't think that there can be a progressive case for that technology. It's extremely dangerous.
On escalation, of course it's going to get worse, like this biosis and the climate irregularity. But I do think it's a somewhat apolitical way to just focus on that kind of as a trajectory that just depends on where we kind of manage to lock the warming of the climate. Because apart from very few things like very sudden, unpredictable hurricanes, rockfalls, and floods, most of the problems that climate change creates for humans depend to like 90% on the way that humans organize their form of life. So whether you let people drown where they are, or whether you let them in like share the areas that are still productive, that, I mean, that's what makes the difference. And I still think like everything that we are afraid of in the future from suffering from climate change is already happening to someone now, right? I mean, there's disease and famine and toxification and all that. So everything depends on how we organize ourselves, well, as a species, in solidarity to like redress those harder living conditions. And you can kind of imagine that a kind of form of life in a kind of harder climate, but with proper solidarity is far more livable and secure. Even though I do think it will be laborious, like the left fantasy of abolishing work kind of straight on, like abolishing work and then never get up from the hammock. Like I think that's over with the climate crisis, at least as a kind of majority occupation. But even like obviously the more refined version of that always was like making work non-alienated and making it into another way of spending your time. And even that, I think, is still possible. I mean, for me, if I see now those young people who start their solidarity, like community agriculture projects, how they don't work themselves to death in the way that my parents like literally worked themselves broken in kind of competing on the market with the organic produce, like, wow, you know, even though already now in Brandenburg we have more desertification and it's harder to farm. So I just think as a left movement, we have to like stick with that horizon of solidarity that might even make life materially better. But even if it doesn't, it makes it meaningful. And like, it's still then a life spent better in solidarity in the face of catastrophe. Like the harshening of the conditions only makes solidarity more important.
So a little word on Kim Stanley Robinson. It's a must-read book, obviously, but I agree with Andreas's critique. I think it's very problematic in a number of ways. I'd add one thing. There is no non-violent direct action in it. There is no, that element of diversity of tactics is not present, and I found that deeply bizarre. Look, in terms of what Andreas says, how the way he characterizes what I'm offering, I don't think it's fair for the following reason. He talks about going back. I'm not talking about doing what the old moderate flank did. I've already tried to lay out a number of the ways in which it would be different. Possibly the most crucial difference is that whereas standardly radicals have tended to go further than moderates in being willing to call the situation, to name it as it is, I'm suggesting we need a ruthlessly, rigorously more truth-based movement than we've ever had before, and that actually it's the radical flank that when push comes to shove tends to actually step back, recoil a little bit from facing the full truth and the full horror of the situation, because it reaches for fantasy politics solutions. Now, in relation to politics, Eva says we need a left movement that's what I'm questioning. I'm saying if we're actually going to be serious about doing the most we can do to stop the future being unbelievably appalling, we need to move beyond the politics of leftism. We need to think instead in the kind of way that people thought during the Second World War, when you had left-style solutions being brought in, not on the basis of leftist ideology. That is the way, in a polarized society, you can actually get somewhere. And I'm putting it to you that it's the only way. The logic of the climate crisis is that there is no path to non-collapse without the many on board. We can take the path that there is via the emergency, the more than emergency. We begin from what we need in common, from what our children need, not from a politics of grievance, nor from a politics of theoretical analysis such as class. Class is clearly crucial now, it's part of the reality of our world, but our common interest in the very long term is also crucial. The latter has no parallel in the anti-capitalist class struggle. We have a common enemy in this struggle. The common enemy is eco-driven civilizational collapse. Exit from the world is a delusion. There's no reality to people saying, you know, Musk is going to go and live on Mars and so on. You know, good luck. It's not going to happen, right? We have something in common, that this is not a zero-sum game in the kind of way that capitalist class struggle is a zero-sum game. So I'm suggesting that if we actually want to win in as much as winning as possible, we have to move beyond the framing of leftism, and we have to think about policies like nationalization as a common sense response to the issues that we face. And that is now possible, that is available because of the extreme way in which the capitalists and the elites have fucked up in relation to the Ukraine crisis.
I mean, one of the problems with that, and maybe also with the analogy that you made with the Second World War, is that, and which we have seen, I think, in the pandemic, right? I mean, is that if you drop the leftist frame, you know, you might do it for strategic reasons, but if you do it for other reasons, I mean, the problem is that you end up with kind of the tendency to think of national solutions to, you know, an egoistic apartheid, global apartheid solutions to this common challenge, right? I mean, so my question is, how can you move beyond that tendency to reestablish, you know, global apartheid in response to the climate catastrophe without a kind of leftist transnational solidarity? I mean, and I just don't know what other, you know, what kind of non-leftist vision of transnational solidarity would there be that can counter this nationalizing tendency? That tendency is very strong. We have seen it at work in the pandemic. We've seen it at work in the way in which
How have you seen it in the pandemic?
just societies centering their wagons, wanting, you know, Canada has 10 times the doses of vaccine it can use, etc. So vaccine nationalism, the complete disregard for, so, you know, how can you avoid that? And we see that already, I think, with the climate catastrophe as well, without having that explicit kind of internationalist or transnationalist frame.
So just to respond very briefly to that specific point, vaccine nationalism is actually ultimately irrational. It's irrational because you're just setting up the breeding ground for more fresh variants, right? So actually, again, you can make the argument for internationalism and solidarity on a basis which is completely compatible with self-interest. I don't think that common interests of humanity is the property of leftism as an ideology.
Yeah, Andreas, please, and then Eva.
Yeah, I'm itching to say something here. I fundamentally disagree with the idea that there is a kind of a common interest in all of humanity to stave off this crisis. Yes, on a very, very abstract level, that might be true. But below that level, you have a very concrete situation of the ruling classes of this planet having a very vested material interest in business as usual and in keeping it going. And this applies to investment and to consumption. So at the level of investment, what we're seeing now is the large private energy companies enjoying some of the largest profits in the history of the capitalist mode of production and using them to invest in ever more fossil fuel installations. As for consumption, you have a situation where the richest 1% have emitted more than twice as much as the poorest half of humanity over the past 3 decades. And this kind of inequality is only widening. Now, the ultra-rich, the capitalist class, can survive apocalypse better than anyone else. They're preparing to do it with their bunkers and all of that. They don't have any kind of urgent interest in breaking with the status quo. To the contrary, they're doing everything they can to defend it. This is the force that we have to defeat through an antagonistic mobilization of a larger social force. There is no other way forward. It's not like the nationalization of these companies is some kind of an open door that we can just pass through, as in 1945. A nationalization of a company like Total would mean to inflict a crushing blow on the fraction of the capitalist class in France that is tied up with that company. There's no other way that that can happen. I mean, it's a total illusion of what such a change in property relations would mean, to think that it could happen in any other way than through very intense and sharp social struggle. This is not to be doctrinaire about leftist ideologies, just to recognize the clash of interests that fundamentally structures our societies. And I think, obviously, the climate movement is a very small agent in this landscape still. So groups like Just Stop Oil or the tire extinguishers are puny actors. Because perhaps the climate struggle, including its phases of escalation, should have started long ago. We're behind the curve, but the curve that is developing in these movements is one of rapid escalation, in the sense that when I talk to people in Just Stop Oil, they say that, okay, we've smashed petrol stations, the next step will be to go after the corporate headquarters and the new fossil fuel installations that are being built in the UK with the lifting of the ban on fracking, and with all the drilling rights that are licensed for the British sector of the North Sea. In the tire extinguishers, the conversation is about, okay, what's the next target? Well, it's probably the private yachts, the super yachts, and the private jets, which I think is a target that we should have gone for quite some time ago. And if that curve develops, which it seems to be doing in this movement, then that's something that I would not only applaud, but I would be very happy to engage in it myself. And I think that more of us should, in a very practical manner.
Yeah, I totally agree from the perspective of action. And then I think from the perspective of reflection, we have to be honest about the fact that how deeply saturated at least all the kind of northern industrial populations are with a completely irrational but very powerful ideology of property. And that, like, what it is a kind of fantasy to simplify one's struggle to say we're only up against those 2%. And it's maybe the kind of, it's the real analysis of the situation in terms of like who holds the resources and who we need to defeat. But if the majority of the populations who are at the moment like turning increasingly fascist sort of take the side of the yacht owners, then like we have that just changes how to think about the struggle. And I think like that's of course also how Rupert then says we need to somehow have this moderate wing. But I feel like it's the right thing to do myself to like attack some property. But if I'm telling that to someone, I feel I have to also be honest about the fact that you will probably experience a backlash and a criminalization and a kind of isolation in the general discourse landscape that like is very drastic. And it might, like, even though it's the right thing to do, I at the moment am very pessimistic about how that can achieve any political change if it's not backed by a real mass movement. And I do think it has to be, and I do think the escalation from within the German environmental movement is not a sign of strength. It comes from a place of weakness and desperation and losing the numbers. And it's still the right, that's the, like, there's not, what else is there, right? I mean, of course, but if you have something like, for instance, Standing Rock, where you have a really, like, a base for the protest and then sabotaging some of the diggers, like, then you have some hope of kind of sustaining, or I would say again, regenerating that movement. And otherwise, I think you also can't like just run into those, those open blades of how this liberal society in its kind of total death drive of identifying with the sort of sovereignty of the owners and like casting everyone who attacks the property boundaries as they are as monstrous and criminal. Like, we also have to somehow work with that reality. But I mean, I know that you know that, but I feel it needs to be brought up as part of the analysis.
So is it just purely abstract, the point that I'm making about common interest here? The collapse of international food systems is not in anyone's interest. Major desertification is not in anyone's interest, etc. I do think that there is a non-naive way of suggesting that there is enormous possibility. This is something that Chenoweth is now very interested in, not that I'm a particular fan of hers, but this is a good point that she makes, I think. There is enormous potentiality now in getting a lot of defections from elites who are, in my experience, in many cases, coming to recognize that we cannot go on like this. And do we place ourselves in the best position to attract those defections by gluing ourselves to motorways or smashing up their cars? Or do we place ourselves in the best position to do that by mobilizing more people than have ever been mobilized before on the basis of the truth and inviting them to join us? In terms of nationalizing Total, yeah, it would be a crushing blow against international capital. My point is merely, you don't have to do it because it would be a crushing blow against international capital. You can do it because it just makes sense. And it just makes, it's increasingly common sense to majorities in countries like this one, in countries like the UK, certainly in the UK, that this is what ought to happen. And I say, let's go with that. And in general terms, what I'm trying to do here is obviously for many of us, to take us outside of our comfort zones. There's something comfortable about the idea of escalation. There's something comfortable about staying ideologically pure. There's something comfortable about having an ideology that puts one on the side of the oppressed. And I'm suggesting perhaps there's something more important than staying comfortable in those ways. Perhaps we need to think rigorously and ruthlessly about what are the actual potential ways forward that could put us in the best possible position to weather what is coming. And that's what I'm trying to offer.
So at some point we should talk about the distinction that Jacob insisted in yesterday between nationalization and socialization, because they're not the same thing, but we will open it up in a moment. Just one last question maybe for the panel before we do so. So Rupert talked about the need for alliances. Eva invoked solidarity. There's one level on which I think we still have to, think much harder and look for transversal practices maybe, and that is the solidarity across different struggles. I mean, Eva, you just mentioned indigenous struggles. On the one hand, you could say, well, there's an interesting convergence if you look at social movements and struggles today, because they have become much more explicit in pushing for systemic change rather than just single issue reforms here or there. And that's true for, class-based movements. It's true for climate activism. It's true for, indigenous struggles, migrant struggles, anti-racist struggles, etc. But on the other hand, it feels as if that very often stops at the rhetorical level. So, climate activists say, well, our struggle has to be, feminist, queer, anti-racist, etc. at the same time. But it's not yet clear how that exactly translates either in the organization or in the relations between the political subjects of these struggles, or in fact in terms of how we think about the aims of these struggles. So I was just wondering whether the three of you could speak to that weird schizophrenia, the growing awareness that, well, yeah, there has to be systemic change and it has to involve all these different aspects. The Green New Deal, the Red New Deal, they all push in that direction, right? But at the same time, there still seems to be a lot of divergence and self-isolation to a certain extent on the practical level. Yeah, do you want to start, Rupert, and then?
Yeah, so I'm delighted you asked that question, because this is another aspect of what we're trying to envisage and envisaging what a new moderate flank could look like. So for many of us in this room probably, a comfort zone includes the importance of, say, intersectionalist identity politics. But for many people in broader society, that is not the case. That is not part of their comfort zone. And if you say to them, in order to join our climate movement, you have to sign up to this full intersectionalist identity politics agenda, they will say, well, then I'm not going to join your climate movement. So the awkward, uncomfortable question is, are we ready to create alliances that could actually win, in as much as winning means anything now? Because, as I've said, whatever happens, there are going to be unimaginable horrors coming. Are we willing to reach out to people who are not, in that sense, ideologically close to us, or not? Are we ready to have small c conservative people be part of what we do? Are we ready to involve many in the working class who, frankly, are completely alienated by large amounts of environmentalist or climate justice type discourse, or not? And what we want to suggest is, let's imagine and let's try to co-create a, in the sort of spiral dynamics terms, if that means anything to some of you, a teal climate movement, a climate movement that moves beyond being green in its ideological purity dimension, and seeks to make common cause with people who we disagree with politically, for example. Is the crisis so big and deep and wide that we're willing to do that, or not? And I suggest that it is, and that it should be, and that this is a challenge we should try to rise to.
So unless you're speaking of some sort of superficial self-righteous politics of language, then I think I fundamentally disagree with that, because I think if solidarity with other movements means like declaring their struggle for survival and for the end of violence as like, oh, a comfort zone that we need to leave, like, I think that's really a kind of the end of any like progressive alliance. And in fact, I think the opposite can be observed on the ground of successful mass mobilization. So you said how, like Robin, you framed it as if it's an open question how those movements kind of merge their aims. But I think, for instance, Black Lives Matter is the biggest feminist and trans feminist movement of, well, even the 20th, but definitely the 21st century. And the way that Ende Gelände has, so the German climate movement, has factored in care work and the whole sustain, like cooking in the camps and all that kind of stuff, and changed the kind of gender dynamics in their processes and everything, like that has actually helped make the movement more sustainable. It's not just a splitting force, it's helping within the movement, and it enables the very practice of linking those like movements that I think only by a very distorted liberal optic look like different topics. And one thing that, I mean, I always stress is that at a certain level, we see a striking and fascinating convergence of mobilizing style and protest forms across the spectrum of very different intersecting struggles around the figure of life and the threat against always sort of the particular most vulnerable life of certain groups, but also life in general. And so Ni Una Menos, like organizing from the cases of femicide, or Black Lives Matter organizing against police violence and sort of in an abolitionist way, they all invoke figures of life lived in solidarity and flourishing, and are kind of, I think, already starting to reconquer some of what I would call a regenerative sort of time, where it is threatened the most. And I think part of building a mass movement is building a bridge between those movements, or see that they are already joined. And I do also think that the sincerity of some of the more radical movements actually wins over. I mean, I'm actually a bit uncomfortable with this whole talk about like there's this figure of a normal person that is already imagined as being somehow like, I mean, yeah, small c conservative or backward or whatever. I experience some of the kind of very, like, every Tuesday I do martial arts with a group of people who have very different professions from me and are all men. And it started with them saying, oh, I cannot fight with a woman, to now them being like, oh, and if you fight against your Gegnerin, so assuming that fighters can be people, you know, it just happens. I didn't have to cancel anyone. Like, you just have to engage, but not in some kind of indoctrinating, how can I win you over? But like, okay, what's your problem? Oh, the rising heating bill. They actually told me about this warm water reservoir that is under our small town, and that you could drill into to like give heating to the whole small city. So I do believe that it's also dangerous to already sort of fantasize an advanced compromise. And then, yeah, some of them also are fascists, and then you have to fight. But those you wouldn't have won onto our side, like you maybe for 10 minutes. But then, as soon as the question of do we open the borders to more immigration or not, if like sea levels rise, you would lose them anyway. So kind of compromising with some people you can't cooperate with also doesn't strengthen the movement. Yeah, sorry, end of rant.
Andreas?
Yeah, briefly on intersectionality in these things. In the case of Fridays for Future, the escalation so far has primarily been rhetorical and discursive. There's been a radicalization since 2018-19 in terms of how that movement talks, and it very much takes the form of talking about intersectionality, which is like the buzzword for the kids when you meet them and you go to their camps or whatever activities they have. And this is a step in the right direction as far as I see it. It is a step to the left, which to me is a good thing, that the Fridays for Future is moving that direction. Greta Thunberg very clearly does and has been doing for the last couple of years. I would like the movement to go further to the left in the sense that I think it needs a more explicit anti-capitalist orientation that goes beyond intersectionality, which I have my doubts about as the sort of, ideological panacea or, the key that opens up the world. I think that there are problems with that as an analytical model, but we don't need to go into that now. Just to an extent, you see similar things with Ende Gelände, which in its latest camp in Hamburg in August had a very prominent focus on decolonizing and on anti-colonialism, which again is a step in the right direction. But I also think that there might be issues around strategic focus there. I think that the movement really needs to be very precise in its targeting of fossil capital, or however you define the enemy. A few, which is not to in any way diminish the importance of building alliances with other movements. To the contrary, that's the only way we can succeed. Just a few comments on other things that have been said here. Well, if nationalization, if common sense was a sufficient condition for nationalization or socialization, it would have happened long ago. The point I'm making is not that we should nationalize, take over these companies because it would inflict a crushing blow on fractions of the capitalist class. It's just that is a necessary condition for achieving goals related to climate mitigation. And I am personally not interested any longer, if I ever was, in trying to facilitate the defection of individuals from the capitalist class. I'm interested in the movement building a force that can inflict material costs on that class. That's what we haven't succeeded in so far. Now, on the issue of repression and backlash that Eva correctly brought up, I think that we will inevitably, in any escalation, I mean, it's happening already before escalation, face problems of criminalization, repression, and things like that. But further escalation, including diversification into things like sabotage, requires a rethinking of our relation to the repressive state apparatus. And here is where I think Just Stop Oil and other parts of the movement in the UK need to engage in some revision of their ideas, because you cannot have a tactic that is escalating while continuing to see arrest as a virtue. And this remains part of the civil disobedience protocol for Just Stop Oil, coming out of the XR tradition, that being arrested is part of your political action. And you want to be arrested because there is this moral idea that you have to be accountable for what you're doing. That's part of the nonviolent ethics, and it's a way to send a message. But of course, it's impossible to tell people to step up and do more illegal things, such as sabotage, while also expecting them to get arrested. So I think that the climate movement really needs to adopt the Ende Gelände position on the repressive state apparatus, which is that every arrest is a failure, and you want to avoid being arrested for as long as possible, and you want to accomplish as much as possible without being taken by the cops. And this is the orientation of the tire extinguishers as well, and I think we have to move in that direction when we escalate. This is not a matter of purity, it's not a matter of comfort, it's the exact opposite. It's adopting an impure mix of different kind of tactics, not the purity of non-violence, and it's opening up for what will be inevitably an uncomfortable confrontation with the repressive state apparatus. I'll end there and just observe that we haven't, to my surprise, even mentioned the question of soup and Van Gogh, but maybe that will come up in this.
Well, I promised Thomas that we will have at least half an hour for Q&A with the audience, and that time has come now. So please raise your hands, and I'll try to call on people and see. So let's start with Oksana here in the front, and then I'll try to move towards the back. Yeah.
My comment concerns Andrea's suggestion, because I also rather identify myself as a climate Leninist, and I was thinking along the similar lines, and the idea was that climate struggles, climate politics corresponds to the models of the political politics. And Leninist strategy comprises several things. And the basics are the underground work. Can there be a climate underground? In his book, the leftist disease, the infantile disease of leftism in communism, he said that the underground work presupposes the art of not being arrested. It is an art. When I learn from the current struggles, the current political underground in Russia, I see that that first comes this necessity of not being arrested, and the strategic vision develops in the course of the catastrophe. So first you do like modest movements, a little sabotage and things like that. But then one have to think about the organizational moments. And here is the time for the underground strategies. And the second element is not a Leninist, but rather Marxist, is an international. Can there really be a climate international? Because the problems are so different in different countries, and also the governments are really different. Like the China and Russia and UK, they have like different. They have different goals. How to oppose them? Can there be a climate revolution, or should we still strive for climate reformation? Should a movement go underground, taking nature as its model? Should the anti-oil movement, the Stop Oil movement, somehow go with the, somehow mimic the subjectivity of the pipeline itself, which is an exploited natural substance. But this is also a question about the connection, actually, of the theoretical and the practical part of our discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's add a few more voices. So there's a question here on the left, and then yeah.
thank you so much for all the smart things you said. My impression was there was like one thing everybody could agree on, and that was that like to like really develop effective strategies, we need to convince way more people to do something against the climate crisis. And my impression was it was very strongly focused, the discussion on what strategy would be the best for that. And so my question is like going a little bit in a different direction. What do you think is the major factors that are holding people back? Is it like the feeling of having to give up on one's own consumption practices? Is it the feeling of like of doom, that everything is already lost? Is it the problem that one might have to say, well, okay, capitalism simply doesn't work, and people don't like to hear that or say that? Is it the fact that people are most of the time simply busy with like struggling for their own survival and simply don't have the time? Or is it like the complexity of the issue, that it's such an like it can appear as a very abstract, complicated thing where you should be an expert to even think and talk about it? So probably it's like all of the above to a certain extent, but my interest would be what you think is really the core issue that we have to like tackle, and maybe if you have some ideas what you think should be done to like overcome this like things that hold people back.
Great, thank you. Let's have a third question. I'm sorry, Thomas, to send you across the room, but here in the second, trying to achieve some geographic justice. So, yeah, then we'll have a round on that.
Thank you for the interesting discussion. This question is probably very different from the first two. But I see that perhaps in order to find a larger resonance, it is necessary to make the climate catastrophe about a question about our children and our grandchildren. But I think there's also something very disconcerting, at least to me, about climate activism, in that it seems to be somehow less concerned about the future of non-human animals or other species than just a question about generational justice. And here I think it's somehow the more theoretical discussion we had just before with Christoph Menke, especially something that came out in response in the discussion, that we can somehow maybe forget the animal but never get rid of it, seems to be more powerful than most of climate activism's, I don't know, just mild discomfort, but largely ignorance of the possibility of absolute annihilation of other species. So yeah, I personally cannot imagine living without other animals in nature and just wilderness. So yeah, my question is just, is there a possibility of a more inclusive idea of justice when it comes to climate activism?
Yeah, well, I'll start with that. As you might have gathered from the question I asked in the Menke session, I'm very sympathetic to what you say there. But with my climate strategist hat on, what I also always think about here is what is liable to move the most people. And I don't think you and I are at all unique, but I think that there are many more people who are much more concerned about their children and grandchildren than they are really concerned about non-human animals. Now, obviously, you can connect the two in numerous ways. I seek to talk about this in my book, Parents for a Future. But what we're trying to do in the new moderate flank is to start where people are. Our thought is we're actually not going to get the critical mass that we need if we don't start where people are. And I think mostly where people are is much more around concern for their children and grandchildren than concern for the more than human. And I think we should go far further than we have yet in trying to make that concern focal and get people to understand what it means. In terms of what holds people back from getting more involved, I think that a key factor remains that most people are still keeping at arm's length or don't quite know how bad the situation is and how bad it's going to get and how much this is going to affect their children and their grandchildren, including almost certainly those of the extremely rich as well. And that is why we need to be rigorously truth-based. And this is what almost the entire climate movement until incredibly recently has shied away from. So this is why I spend a lot of my time at the moment working with people in the radical flank like Scientist Rebellion and in the emerging moderate flank who are placing front and center the need to tell the whole truth. For example, that we are not going to stay below 1.5 degrees, that is a fantasy, and that the idea that you can mobilize people most effectively by giving them more and more implausible stories about how we're going to stay in the so-called safe zone below 1.5 degrees of global overheat is just a reheating of modes of seeking to vitalize action, which have been shown to fail. What we ought to do instead is mobilize people on the basis of the horrendous injustice and the terrifying failure that we are all implicated in, but that above all the political elites and our so-called leaders and the fossil fuel lobby are implicated in. And what those of us who believe that this narrative shift could be crucial believe is that if we switch from saying, come on, if we just try harder, we can stay below 1.5 degrees to 1.5 degrees is gone. We are already moving into a new horrendous terra incognita. You have been lied to, you have been betrayed, your children are going to reap the whirlwind. We think that that could be the basis for a huge uprising of people who are as yet unwilling to rise up. And what those people need is they need to not feel isolated, and they need to be given on-ramps which they can relate to action and agency. I think it's extremely implausible that the radical flank will be able to offer that to most people, to some, but not to most people. And that's why I'm trying to do what we're trying to do. And I come back again to the point about polarization and repressive reaction. My judgment is that serious mistakes were made in Extinction Rebellion, for example, when public transport was targeted. Andreas and I agree about that. That the Insulate Britain strategy was disastrous in terms of alienating people, and that Just Stop Oil is making some good moves and some not so good moves, and that this all adds up to a situation where we have a lot of polarization and a lot of repressive reaction. If I envisage there being a lot more sabotage and ecotage in the next few years, I don't see that situation getting any better. We have to co-create a situation in which most people are willing to move towards more vigorous action themselves. And I don't see them doing that when they are continually being stimulated in a way which is way beyond their comfort zone, even as they are learning the truth about how bad things are. I think we have to take people on a journey. Yeah, it's going to take a while, and that's going to have enormous collateral damage. I don't see any alternative.
I'll be very brief. To the underground, I like that, and I would just want to always add this perspective of who's doing the regenerative labor, what kind of practices are happening already that we might not recognize as fighting and yet are on the right side, so to see. What's holding people back, I really think general exhaustion and the kind of like almost, the kind of almost sadistic reality principle absorbed in that exhaustion under a neoliberal responsibilization regime where it's all is your fault and life just is pain. And then, you know, who would then hope for a better, more tender future? I think that's one thing. And I do think that very concrete experiences of solidarity, also sort of on the ground, help break that. And on a more abstract level that maybe we philosophers are more responsible for, a wrong notion of sort of negative, toxic, even freedom. I think that's a big thing. And for the grandchildren thing, like, as you also, I wouldn't want to center the struggle on intergenerational justice for lots of reasons that maybe I don't need to even elaborate. I would love to see a much fuller understanding of freedom that can even integrate, like, you know, where the fact that we might live without hearing birds sing is an actual like diminishment of our human freedom. And if you like, that would be great if that could be established. And at the same, of course, some people feel that already.
Andreas?
Yeah, on the question of a climate underground, it's a very good one. I think it's by no means inconceivable to have underground work on the climate front, and I think we might be moving in that direction, but we should recognize that the organizational capacity of progressive forces in our era is extremely limited. I mean, and this is one of the findings in this recent paper by Chenoweth, that in the, or at least as it's interpreted, in the era of social media, the left, or social struggle in general, has taken on an extremely evanescent, transient character, where it's extremely easy to call people out on the streets and attract large numbers, but it's just as easy for this whole bubble to deflate and people to go home. And what's missing is any kind of solidity or continuity in organizational infrastructure, such as would be required to pull off anything like underground struggle. And this is what's so incredibly relevant in the Leninist idea of the vanguard, as he laid out in What Is to Be Done, which has, striking similarities to the current situation, even though it's describing a completely different political situation, where, what he described was these spontaneous eruptions that came and went. But to sustain a struggle, you need something more. You need an organizational structure, and in this sense, I'm all for the Leninist idea of the vanguard, which is not in opposition to the idea of mass politics, to the contrary. Now, on the question of an international, I think you're right. It's hard to see something like the third international for the climate struggle, or the second, or for the fourth, for that matter, the one that I happen to belong to, because you can't have that kind of coordination that these internationals originally had, but to think of climate politics on the international scale is necessary. But the networks would need to take other forms of the contacts, the relations between movements would have to take other forms than a more or less centralized international. Now, on the question of what's the major thing holding people back, I think it's incredibly difficult to tell, and I don't think the science, the psychological research that has been done has come up with anything like an answer to this question. What is the single most important factor? It's a whole host of factors. You mentioned some of them. I think that one that we shouldn't underestimate is a paralysis, a sense among a lot of people that business as usual is almost like a natural force. It's something that we can't intervene in. It just happens to us. It's a destiny. It's a fate. It's like a mountain range or a volcano eruption or something like that. And that is something that the climate movement could potentially break, that sort of perception, by showing that no, these fossil fuel installations are entirely amenable to intervention and disruption. And it's, in fact, possible for ordinary humans to take these over and shut them down. And this is what Ende Gelände has accomplished in this country. Unlike before 2015, I don't think anyone really considers coal mines in Germany like a part of the natural landscape any longer. Everyone knows that it's intensely contested, even though obviously the mines are still there. But the contestation is something that the movement has succeeded in creating. On the question of animals, yeah, I'm in full sympathy with your sentiment, and I very much deplore that it has proved much more difficult to, turn the biodiversity crisis into a political project, unlike the climate crisis, more narrowly conceived. Extinction Rebellion has succeeded to an extent in making the idea of extinction central to its project. But to me, I have to admit that if you look at the past few months, what enrages me more is the indifference to the suffering of non-white people, notably in Pakistan, in the past few months, where you've seen an entire country being fundamentally devastated by climate catastrophe, and that elicits very little outrage and reaction in the global north. If you compare the amount of outrage that the soap throwing on Van Gogh elicited in the UK with, it's like, oh, 10 or 20 million people just displaced from their homes and, living in stagnant water. It's part of the background noise of our era. It's, it's the fate of the non-white wretched of the earth. But touching a painting by Van Gogh, how dare you? I mean, it really offends establishment sensibilities in a way that the scenes of non-white misery do not. And here I think the climate movement in the global north needs to shoulder its historical responsibility, because the problem for people in Pakistan is that the sources of their misery are far away. And this is apparently a discourse that's been quite widely disseminated in Pakistan over the past months, with people saying that we are suffering the consequences of what people in rich countries have been doing. Which means that people, farmers and workers in Pakistan who have their lives shattered by climate change have very little capacity to strike back against the perpetrators of this violence, because these perpetrators do not live nearby. They live far away. And it's our responsibility in the global north to fight the fight that they cannot fight for geographical reasons. And here really is a reason for movements in the global north to revitalize some of the old anti-imperialist tradition, the idea that we can have an anti-imperialist front in the global north that fights in alignment with people in the global south. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have time for one short last round. Alexei, and yeah, I think we can only take one or two more questions. That Alexei is next, and then.
Thank you. There are a few questions in the chat of the live stream. So, for example, a question for Robert. Serafine Frimmer asks, why should the appeal to the truth work as the basis of such a divisive political struggle? And there are some examples of people voting for someone who will objectively worsen their situation and stuff like this. So where is your trust in the truth? How can it be explained? And another question, someone quoted Ursula Le Guin with a long quotation that ends with the sentence, resistance and change often begin in art, and very often in our art, the art of words. And Franek Korbanski asks, how do you see the role of art and culture in motivating people to act on climate? I think it's a question for all the three of you. And finally, there's a question to Andreas. Ted's asks, how do you estimate the potential for dual power in the climate change movements? Ted's claims that in your book you also write about the joys of acting collectively in a democratic way, and communal resistance to extractivism are about establishing power that would be diagonal to established governmental and corporate power. So Ted's claims that it seems closer to council communism than to Leninism or anarchism, and suggests that that might be a way to move beyond the failed opposition between the national and the global.
Okay, these were three questions, so we just take one last one in the back, and then I'm under very strict instructions to end on time, so I'm afraid we have to have a last round on the panel after your question.
So I thought there's a Lenin quote that's relevant where he says that politics begins where the masses are, not in thousands, but in millions of people. So I actually think the whole panel actually agrees on that Leninist sentiment. But I just wanted to say that I'm very unconvinced that you can build that mass politics with a focus on the truth and the knowledge of the climate science. And I think I'm much more convinced by Eva's call for really to root climate politics in life and the reproduction of life. And I think someone brought this up earlier, where the Yellow Vest movement talked about politicians talk about the end of the world, but we're just trying to get to the end of the month. So if we can actually make climate about those end of month struggles, I think that's going to translate into that mass movement. I have a question though. A premise of the panel was that the climate movement in 2018, 2019 was extremely powerful and effective, but I just want to ask, what did that movement actually win in terms of real climate action? Was it the European Green Deal? I mean, what exactly did they win? And similarly, about the tire extinguishers, if they are waging a class struggle, what are they doing to erode the power of the industry producing SUVs and profiting off of SUVs? In fact, I think they might be suffering right now just simply because of the energy crisis, and people don't want to buy SUVs when it's costly to fuel them. So what actually are these climate movements actually winning in terms of real power is the question I want to ask.
Okay, so we'll have a few minutes for each of you to select from this rich set of questions whatever you want to talk about. Andreas, let's start with you, Rupert, and then Eva.
Yeah, super. Oh, sorry.
Okay. The question of art, I think maybe I'll leave that out. Yeah. I mean, I would have things to perhaps say on literature. I wouldn't have things to say on paintings or whatever, visual arts. But I think I'll leave that out. The dual power, yes. I don't think that we are going to see any kind of dual power of the original kind as it was conceptualized in the years just at the end and after the First World War, when you had an actual historical situation in Europe of the working class organizing its own organs of power in the form of councils, Soviets, Rätt, and all these things. I mean, that's not going to happen again because the working class looks so different from what it did in 1917 to 19. But dual power in a much wider, almost metaphorical sense, it would by necessity be the shape of something like a climate revolution, where the climate movement, however you define it, with its various social allies, which might very well include some kind of trade union component at some point, would establish a counterpower that would represent an alternative locus of power in society, coming into confrontation with the power of the existing order. I mean, this could take the form of ZAD zones. I mean, that if you extend that exponentially, it would represent a kind of a spatially organized dual power. We don't know what this will look like, but yes, dual power in one form or another seems necessary to accomplish what we want to accomplish. Now, okay, what did the movement accomplish in 2018-19, and what are the tire extinguishers accomplishing? Well, let's be honest, no climate movement that we know of has managed to fundamentally dent the curve. But these are actually really existing climate movements that are engaged in real fights on the streets. And I think they distinguish themselves from the idea of trade unions taking the leadership in the climate movement by the fact that they do exist. The idea that trade unions should make up the prime mover of the climate movement is a nice one. It just so happens that it's a dream that has no corresponding reality to it. And I think, I mean, this is the whole idea of communist politics, going back to the Communist Manifesto and also the Leninist quote that you made, that communists, their first responsibility is to be active in the actually existing movements. And anyone who was in Germany, I think, really had a moment in 2019 when we saw the climate movement actually existing as a major social force. I don't think the tire extinguishers are a major social force, but they certainly are, you know, on the way to, in certain towns, in the UK not the least, establishing something like a deterrence against SUV consumption, which isn't a small thing, given how large emissions SUVs cause, and given the way that society still normalizes or even glorifies SUVs. None of what has happened so far has been enough, but I think our task is to develop what exists in terms of actual climate struggle in our countries.
Yeah, so a key theme of what I've been trying to bring here this evening is that I don't believe there are any shortcuts. And part of my trust in truth is the belief, which I think is pretty well attested historically, that in the long run, the truth will out. And what we need to do is make the long run shorter. And the truth, by the way, doesn't just mean the truth about climate science, it means the truth about the whole shebang, including, for example, as Andreas just said, the truth that in terms of actual policy change, etc., we've achieved virtually nothing yet. And that's the kind of thing that needs to be reckoned with. What was achieved in 2019 was what appears to be a permanent raising of climate consciousness and the ejection of climate denial from any kind of serious presence in politics, and that itself is obviously connected with the truth. I believe that we make progress faster and we increase our response time if we jettison stubborn optimism and embrace a stubborn realism and seek to mainstream it. On the question of Ursula Le Guin, so I'm a huge fan. I think she has an enormous amount to offer. I've developed the concept of a through-topia to suggest what we actually need and what we need desperately from the arts and the media and entertainment industries. So dystopias are not enough. Utopias are now impossible and non-credible. We need through-topias, how we get through what is coming in a way that is as good and effective as possible. And I'm now working closely with a number of filmmakers and dramatists and so forth to try to accelerate this kind of process. I think we need to make it easy for people to imagine, who find it hard to imagine what the future could be like. And when I say what the future could be like, I mean okay futures as well as dire futures. We've got to be able to imagine okay futures and the path to get there. And there's a huge task there. And the final remark, if I may, would just be to say, if what I've said this evening has convinced you at all, then I want to invite you to leave with a question on your mind, which is, what can you do to seek to implement some part of this kind of vision for a new mass moderate flank based in, among other things, a possibility of imagining and making visible to people futures that are terrible and futures that are actually attainable and that we can attain together. What are you going to do to make that possible?
Maybe I want to start by also just celebrating this SUV action. I mean, you've brought it, I just find it so great, and I think maybe that was one of the few tactical mistakes that Ande Gelände did make. You said they made no mistakes. I think in the pandemic they should have moved to car action, and that's like, and anyway, it's beautiful how it's done, and also like that this little lentil that is put in the valve like has all the agency to keep the tire deflated. But I want to say something back to Matt, because I'm afraid, no, I don't. I, of course, say if you want it to work, you need a mass basis. So in that way, I agree. But I don't think that that's what is a necessary condition for politicization as such. In fact, I mean, part of a strand of politics is very familiar to me. It's politics of ACT UP and the AIDS crisis in the 80s. And actually a lot of what Extinction Rebellion now does is exactly kind of reutilizing those strategies, like down to the die-ins and all the art actions. And that was a movement, I mean, of course, the kind of radical queer movement, not the later like right-wing funded, we want to have marriage rights, but the queer movement never thought it had a mass basis. It never even thought it could become hegemonic. It was precisely not the point. The point was to kind of retain some scope for difference but survival. So I think those minoritarian strategies are also important and also worth pursuing, and parts of the climate movements and also ecological like choices to live have more of that strategy, and yet they are politicizing. However, as I said right at the beginning, I do think there is also a real philosophical, not just a strategic question, and the philosophical question changes the strategy when it is the politicization of nature, and when the mass basis or the basis we are looking for is not just people. Somehow we have to have an account of what is the, and I don't even mean it in the new materialist sense, agency, but what is the power still of all the other living entities that we start to be more aware of, as they are in effect striking. I mean, that's what the dysbiosis is, that some of the stuff we took for granted goes away. And I would say that part of the potential of art at the moment is to also translate those processes and those agencies, because they have bring this whole, like the left had such a long time of being like, oh, we don't want to be paternalistic, we don't represent something, and now we're dealing with like the whole of nature that doesn't speak, at least not this, like I speak now. So there is a huge representation problem, and I find it quite fascinating to see how research-based a lot of contemporary art is, how they do better social science and biology than some social science and biologists, and like, or even just Marva Azanios has a new work where she's Lebanese, French, German, Austrian filmmaker. It's about the divorce of a piece of land from the property regime, and there's a kind of very orthodox eco-Marxist and the kind of a bit more new materialist perspective discussing the whole process with lots of legal detail. Like that I think is amazing kind of art that can contribute to this politicization. However, like I also don't have any, like art does a lot of things, and this, I'm not saying art should be just that, but the question sounded quite tactical, so that would be my tactical answer. But yeah, in the end, I think we need something like a council representation of something that cannot fully self-represent. And one model for that, I think, is less Leninism, but a very brief moment in the German November Revolution, where for a short time, there were also housework councils, and then they kind of died again because that was not seen as labor. But I think that's actually a brief moment of something articulating that we could also do for ecological questions, that form of, and then the Leninism would be regeneration and Soviets.
Well, thank you so much for an intellectually and politically very, very provocative and at the same time very constructive discussion. I think that was wonderful. Before we all applaud, I want to give the word to Thomas, our host, and thanking him and hearing his final words on the politics of nature.
Well, no final words on the politics of nature. We are beyond this. The panelists just made those final words. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who was here. It was terrific 2 days, and you made it this wonderful. So thanks, everyone. I also want to thank the ICI once again for hosting this event. Thanks so much. And also, please join me in thanking our technical team who did incredible work the last 2 days. Yeah.